Hello everyone, my name is Gaetano Dimita. I'm one of the organizers of More Than Just a Game. If you're here, you probably know that we decided to postpone a game. So the next More Than Just a Game is going to be in London in April 2022. But it's been a long time. The last More Than Just a Game has been organized, was the one in Warsaw in February last year. And so many things happened during the pandemic. Of course, mainly the pandemic. But on top of that, a lot happened in the video game industry, some good, some bad, and we didn't want to stay another year in silence. So we asked friends if they wanted to join for a webinar. And I'm really happy to finally have the possibility to start what we used to do, traveling around every couple of months to discuss our favorite topic with the best people possible. And this is one of the things that I miss the most from the lack of traveling around. But we will be back soon. We have a great plan for when international travel will be allowed again. We have planned to increase the number of events and actually move out of Europe. But we will keep you posted of all the things that we're planning for our return soon. And I'll leave the floor to the chair for today, Michaela, that will run the conversation from this moment on.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We would like to start this first session of our online series in 2021 to provide a retrospective of 2020 and what kind of year it has been for the video game industry. And to set the scene a little bit, Alexandros has prepared a short video summarizing the sort of main events and news in the industry, which I will attempt to share with you now. So hopefully you can see my screen. And you can hear and see the video. Super. Enjoy.
Video games. Video games.
Video games.
Video games.
Video game.
Video games.
It's been a big year for the sector, with millions of people stuck at home searching for new forms of entertainment. Gaming is seeing record revenue, record engagement, and record numbers of new players.
Leading stats portal Statista documented the revenue from digital purchases of games rising to over $10 billion in March, marking the highest monthly figure ever recorded.
CD Projekt confirms that they have solidified relationships with Witcher books author Andrzej Sapkowski.
Streamers and the company itself taking down fan-made clips from years ago, Twitch calling it a first for their platform.
I am so nervous, though. I really hope that I don't get imposter first.
Their answer this time seems to be to just claim ownership of your mods and custom games.
Fun, easy. Let's try these out. So, angle ABC and angle XYZ are complementary.
In shocking news, Nvidia's game streaming service has lost Activision's and Bethesda's games.
The maker of the popular mobile game Fortnite is suing Apple and Google after both companies removed the game from the online app stores.
Epic Games has executed an unprecedented campaign against Apple and Google for the 30% cut those guys take of revenue from their respective app stores.
The Apple versus Epic antitrust trial is on week 2 of arguments to decide if Apple's App Store is a monopoly.
Game Pass, which is the largest game content subscription out there, 15 million subscribers and growing. So getting to work with ZeniMax to bring their amazing collection of games to Game Pass is just an incredible opportunity for us.
Alex, thanks a lot for that. Having set the scene for the theme of today's session, I am pleased to welcome our panelists tonight that are Professor Lorna Woods, Kelvin Plomer, and Kostya Lobov. Professor Lorna Woods is a professor of internet law at University of Essex, and she has an extensive experience in the field of media policy and communications regulation, including data protection, social media, and the internet. Her current research project with Carnegie UK Trust is on reducing harm arising on social media, and she was awarded an OBE in recognition of her work. And we are hoping that tonight she will talk a little bit more about the planned and upcoming legal and regulatory framework in relation to reducing harm online. Next, we welcome Kelvin Plomer, a senior director of player experience at Jagex, which is a company behind Retrospective. Kelvin started off in player support and community management, but for the last 5 years, he's been focusing within Jagex on anti-cheating, online safety, duty of care, and the overall philosophy and values that underline the company's operation. And their approach is to online safety is to sort of monitor any abuse reported by players, monitor the in-game chats, and sort of review the interactions between the players, and really focus on eliminating harmful content from players' interaction as much as possible. And last but not least is Kostya Lobov, who is partner at Harbertle & Lewis, where he advises on different aspects of intellectual property, advertising, and regulatory issues. And he has an extensive experience, again, working with clients in the video game industry and esports sector. And he co-chairs the firm's interactive entertainment group. So welcome, everyone. So happy to have you here tonight. And I would like to give the floor to you, and especially to Kelvin, who represents the industry tonight, and to start with some positive news from the industry's experience of last year, because while many sectors have struggled due to the global pandemic, video game industry, even though it has been affected by the pandemic, it seen an incredible boom when people forced to stay at home and work from home turned to gaming as means to interact, to socialize, to learn, and even to work. So we would like to hear from you on how was 2020 for you in the video game industry, and what do you think are the most positive aspects of last year?
Okay, well, thank you first of all for inviting me to talk. It's a shame that we didn't get the kind of in real life kind of conference going because I was looking to share some horrific experiences of sitting in front of the DCMS Select Committee back in 2019, but maybe that can wait for another day, or I can touch upon that later. I suppose really in terms of kind of 2020, and I mean, you know, you're saying I can kind of speak for the industry, and I speak for Jagex, but there are some kind of broader industry themes that I can kind of pick up on. I suppose really it was bittersweet, and I think that really encapsulates quite neatly what it was. From a very personal level, it was very hard, as kind of we all know. But obviously, as a video game, we saw huge increases in player numbers, and it happened immediately, right? It happened almost overnight, because obviously of lockdown and isolation. And you know, that's going on whilst as employees and as human beings, we were struggling ourselves with the kind of personal challenges. And obviously we were then shifting completely to working from home, doing that at lightning speed. And we actually surprised ourselves in kind of what we were capable of doing in a ridiculously short space of time. So then that kind of backdrop, I suppose, is that the video games market grew by about 30% last year compared to the previous year, and that's based on the UK games industry market valuation, and that 30% growth took it to about £7 billion. And you know, there's a variety of kind of reports, and I mean, Ofcom produced a really useful media use guide, and that shows an increase of over 16 playing games by 62% compared to previous years. You know, it kind of really explores this idea that adults were seeking new forms of entertainment during the pandemic. And according to that report, as well, 92% of 16 to 24-year-olds, which really is kind of our core demographic really at Jagex with RuneScape, were playing games on any device. So it really was helping people through the pandemic, I think. And we were very aware of that. Very kind of early on, we saw this huge spike in players. We realized that people were freaking out a bit due to isolation. We are at Jagex have quite a strong track record in working with mental health charity partners. So actually we spun up quite a lot of support in a kind of COVID support and engagement plan with our players in April and May last year, to put on extra events in game to give people additional content, because we knew they were spending more time in game, and then to also, you know, hook that into our kind of CSR approach with additional fundraising, with signposting and broadcasting messages from our mental health charity partners and from government to our kind of players. And you know, across the industry, you saw some great initiatives like Games for NHS Workers here in the UK, the Play a Part Together campaign, which interestingly was highlighted by the World Health Organization, who maybe 12 months before that said games were the devil and were bad, yet saw the Play a Part Together campaign and were actually saying that it was a really kind of responsible element of what the industry was doing, and that actually games were good for people's mental health. So, you know, you've got kind of conflicting stuff going on there. And, you know, I suppose they saw the writing on the wall and realized, actually, whilst we are stuck at home, it was a definitely positive experience and something that people could use. So, I mean, disconcertingly, I suppose, and frustratingly, right, this comes against a hostile media, hostile backbench MPs, hostile lords, who say, especially with regard to things like kind of loot box and microtransaction spend and all the rest of it, that if it looks like gambling, it is, and then kind of demanding this sort of really tight regulation for what is an entertainment industry. And you know, this loot box debate continues, and there's research, and obviously the government had its call for evidence last November that we inputted into, and continuing a dialogue with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, sorry. And you know, we're waiting to kind of see, and there's lots of conversations happening with them right now into kind of which way that's going to go. So I would say video games have had a positive effect on millions across the world in lockdown. And let's also really not forget that the industry has a massively strong track record in online safety, using AI, machine learning to assist with things like moderation, parental controls across many accessible ways into games, and a very conscientious use of data and a commitment to CSR. And that's the stuff that we don't get to hear about, right? From the kind of headline grabbing stuff that you see in the media. So, what we do is we tell our story. We're proactive, we engage with government, we engage with MPs, we engage with our players, we engage with regulators, and we continue to highlight the positives of really what is a benign entertainment industry. We continue to evolve. So there you go, that's a very brief overview from myself.
Thanks, Kelvin, for that. I would like to now give the floor to Professor Lorna Woods and ask her opinion on, given the arguably positive impact on, as Kelvin said, millions last year that games had, created a entirely new environment for people to stay connected and to stay sane. Why are we seeing new initiatives, legal and regulatory frameworks that are trying to tackle what is perceived as harmful content and harmful interactions online? And games are often being mentioned as one of the main offenders, and yet it doesn't seem that they are considered as the primary target of this regulation and potential new laws. What is your perspective on this development?
Thanks, Michaela. First of all, I should apologise. As some of you may have noticed, I've got my cat with me, who will no doubt contribute great thoughts. Well, I suppose the downside of everybody being online is that, as well as providing a safety valve and a support to many, it also provided a route by which people were abused. Now, this is not necessarily in the context of games, though I suspect you can't just write a blanket exception there. But you do get a lot of charities pointing out that the children, women, minoritized groups were in particular struggling with abusive behavior. And I think this has kept the pressure on for regulation quite generally in this field. And I suppose there's a question that we have to ask, and maybe Kostya will pick this up, that to what extent is the games industry being caught in the crossfire for a range of other issues? So yes, there were questions about loot boxes and gambling and addictive design, which maybe need specific discussion. But what we see in the online safety bill is a general regime that is quite broadly defined. So it has got two categories, user to user services. So this is catching user interaction and how games will be brought into the regime, but it also catches search. Now, the introductory video had a nice little screenshot of Priti Patel and Nikki Morgan and the online harms white paper. And I suppose that's how we can dump what I'm saying into the retrospective category, because this has been a long time coming. I think the green paper, which predated the white paper, was autumn 2017. And the white paper, April 2019, so 2 years ago. And interestingly, at that stage, it wasn't entirely clear that games would be in, though the full government response from December 2020 did say that where games are interactive or allowing interaction between users, then that's where they fall into the regime. So, having said there's a range of issues out there, the gambling, you know, the advertisements and the review of advertising laws, and as Kelvin indicated, also perhaps competition rules kicking into play. I'm just going to give everybody a brief overview of what's going on in this online safety bill, as it's now being called, just to set the scene then for Kostya to pick up some perhaps game-specific points. So the online harms white paper envisaged a duty of care. So this is quite a general overarching rule, and there goes the catch. She obviously doesn't like the proposal. Whereas the online safety bill has still retained the language of duties of care, but instead of an overarching duty, you've got a bunch of different duties that distinguish, on the one hand, between search engines, and on the other hand, between user-to-user services. And then you've got distinctions between different types of content and audience in there. So you've got the general rules which apply to everything, which tackle illegal content. You've got special rules for services likely to be accessed by children. And then you have got the harmful to adult rules, which apply to what are called Category 1 services. Now, it's not entirely clear what a Category 1 service is going to be. And this is in a way a characteristic of the bill. I think we can maybe call it a framework for guidance and further detail coming in through codes of practice, regulatory guidance, and lots of statutory instruments as well from the Secretary of State. And the designation of Category 1 services is one of these areas where we're waiting for detail, though it does seem that it's going to be a combination of size of user base and the functionalities that the service operates. So the first two categories, you've got a quite clear obligation to minimize the problematic sorts of content, so that's illegal or harmful to children. Whereas with regards to the content that's harmful for adults, you've just got to deal with it. And I'm not quite sure what that means. On top of that, there's an obligation across the board to take into account freedom of expression and privacy. And then for Category 1 services, they also have to take into account the importance of content for democratic discussion or debate or something like that, and journalistic content. So that's a nice, complex framework within which we are going to get guidance for Ofcom. Now, everybody's going to have to do risk assessments, and Ofcom will give guidance as to what that looks like. There's a whole list of criteria already in the bill. And then you've got these duties to mitigate, and Ofcom will be coming up with codes of practice as to what good looks like. The timescales for this, I don't know when Ofcom's going to get the time to do all this, but this is a question. When's it all going to be operational? Then Ofcom at the end is a regulatory body, and there's the usual mega fines lurking at the back of all this. I think it's £10 million or 10% of worldwide revenue, whichever is the larger. There's also the government saying it's reserving the right to bring in criminal offences for directors. But that is only if industry doesn't play. I think I've spoken enough. I'm happy to take questions on that, or we can discuss what this all means. But I think over to Kostya, maybe.
Thank you, Lorna. I wanted to ask Kostya, where where was the video game industry as an important stakeholder in this whole process? Were they part of preparing this? Were the regulators listening to the industry's concerns and suggestions? And what will it mean for the industry when this, as Lorna says, becomes operational?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's worth going back to something that Lorna said just now, which is that the games industry was never the primary target of this. They are sort of innocent bystanders, if you like, in this whole thing. The main target was, big tech, which has too much power and has to be reined in. They have too much influence over things like, for example, elections, or can be manipulated to affect things like that, combined with, I suppose, an increased concern across the board, across lots of industries, that vulnerable audiences do need to be protected. And it's a bit weird that there isn't one place, one law which talks about, how that should be achieved online. We have lots of disparate things in the UK which talk about different facets of it, but there isn't like one go-to place where you go to find the rules. So it all stemmed from that. But then, of course, whenever you start talking about regulating the internet as a whole in one piece of legislation, inevitably you're going to end up with something that's very, very broad, because you're trying to capture a lot of different facets, and that's how the games industry becomes a bystander caught up in this, because suddenly it's a user-to-user service. I mean, vast quantities of games will have live comms or chat or UGC sharing features which are built into the game. I mean, RuneScape included, and so they are, most likely going to be caught by this, and so that poses a lot of interesting questions. So, I mean, from a business perspective, most companies will just want to know the answer, like, what do I have to do to comply? The bad news for today's talk is that we don't have the answer for you, because actually nobody knows the answer, not even the regulator. And that's not being facetious, that's just the truth, because we have this bill which is not yet law. It's going to be scrutinized. There might have some amendments, and eventually will become law. But really, where the meat of it, we hope, will be these codes of practice that Ofcom is supposed to draft. And that is where I, at least, am hoping there will be maybe not definitive answers on here's how you do it, here's what a risk assessment looks like. I mean, what does that actually mean? Does that just mean I have to write a piece of paper saying I've done a risk assessment and here's the conclusion? Or does that mean I have to bring somebody in to do it for me, pay them money, and do something a lot more involved? There's guidance in the bill, but again, we're talking to Lorna about this earlier. It's basically just a list of criteria to take into account, and there's so many there that it may as well just say, take into account all the circumstances of the service that you're providing, and then accordingly decide what your risk assessment should be. I mean, that's basically what you end up with. So it's quite difficult to draw out specifics from that, which is always frustrating as a lawyer, because people come to you for advice and they want to know what is it I actually have to do. So I'm pinning quite a lot of hopes on these codes of practice. As Lorna says, the timing will be interesting, because I don't know how exactly this is going to work. So is it going to receive royal assent, and then the implementation date will be later, and in the meantime we're going to get some codes of practice, so industries are going to have time to understand what it is they have to do? Or are we going to get the codes of practice before, as this is making its way to Parliament, at least maybe in draft form, so we can start looking at them and analysing them? That would be good to know. The good thing about codes of practice is that they have more, because it's not kind of the law, they have more leeway to write things in human readable code, human language that people can understand, not statute, and hopefully with even maybe helpful things like examples as to what a different risk assessment might look like for different sizes or types of companies. In terms of games companies specifically, I mean, if I had to make some predictions, I would say more robust age verification will probably become the norm eventually, to the extent that it's not already being done. What robust means, I can't tell you right now, but it will, I guess, in some cases involve using external service providers. So I think that in turn is already spawning, and probably this will accelerate a kind of cottage industry around supplying those kinds of services. I think we could see moves from some of the bigger players in the games industry to in-house those types of services. So we could see some acquisitions around that front to bring age verification type startups and businesses all under one roof, so that can all be done sort of more seamlessly. And I also wonder what effect it's going to have on, if you're making a game and you have a decision to make as to, do I integrate voice comms into it, or do I just frankly leave it out and let people use Discord or whatever, let Discord worry about the regulation that they have to come under? Do I incorporate UGC sharing, or do I just leave that and let people do that on an external platform so I don't have to worry about it? I kind of suspect some of those decisions will be made in favor of the latter in the future. And in practical terms, and I'm going to stop talking in a second so we can discuss it more generally. But I think, the UK clearly has this ambition to kind of lead the way on this, and the slogan that gets rolled out is to make it the safest place in the world to go online, which is a nice vote winner. And we were talking about this earlier, but I think that means two things. Firstly, the UK probably for a while yet will still be a good yardstick in terms of deciding what kind of global policy you adopt to your game, because that's normally the done thing. You look at the more stringent territories and make decisions based on that. And I also wondered to what extent it might influence how other countries will approach this problem. And I know Kelvin and Lorna have some thoughts on that too, so
thanks.
I'll let them chip in. Thanks.
Thanks, Kostya. I was wondering whether Kelvin would like to talk a little bit about his experience with engaging with the Home Office and Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in this whole process. What was your role as a representative of the industry, and do you feel that your experience was in any way reflected in the resulting framework?
Yeah, so I suppose in terms of kind of engagement with the industry, I mean, going back over the last 3 years, we've had a lot of dialogue with both DCMS and the Home Office, and some of that started with kind of inviting them to Jagex, to have discussions with them. We then were subsequently invited to various roundtables. We were shown kind of drafts of things like the codes of practice and all the rest of it. And what's really interesting actually is you can kind of see a few of the changes. And actually, I mean, there's also been roundtables hosted by UKI, the Games Industry Trade Body. We're also a part of the National Crimes Agency Gaming Roundtable. And again, representatives from the Home Office have kind of come to that as well and have talked openly about kind of this stuff. In terms of a couple of kind of real sort of specific points, early on there was talk of things like outlawing VPN use and needing to kind of identify players, and that's without realizing that, well, in most games you have a really quick kind of sign up process where you're not capturing any information, and actually GDPR means that we don't really want to capture hardly any information and store it in any case. So that, that was a kind of a conflict of kind of logic there, and I think the VPN stuff is kind of disappeared. And I think as well, one of the points which was kind of seized upon actually by one of the Home Office officials was this point that actually most games fail, and actually game development and game design is a really perilous business. It's really hard to create a hit game. So then when you've got, in terms of kind of trying to foster and cultivate enterprise, if you've got over constrictive regulation there, particularly on kind of small growing kind of games and the rest of it, then it's only going to hamper economic growth. And I think, again, that's something that we see now through this kind of individual risk assessment that's kind of come out of this. And I think the emphasis in the draft bill now is a lot more on that individual kind of risk assessment there. Actually gives, I think, smaller companies a much more opportunity to actually just make a game and hopefully set it sail and have it to kind of succeed. There are draft codes of practice out there now. They're interim codes of practice. We've audited ourselves against that, and we think roughly a third of it we're doing already, a third of it we can do with a small push, and a third of it is nigh on impossible. And that links back into things like your age verification. Actually talking to the ICO very, very recently, there isn't a system for it. It doesn't exist. Yet the legislation or potential legislation is talking about having age verification, age assurance. No one's defined it yet, and it doesn't actually exist. And the only thing that we've got recently was the tentative use of it for the porn industry, and that fell apart really, really quickly because actually what was designed didn't even work. So if they can't do it for something as hardcore, pardon the pun, as that, then what chance have they got to actually do it for social networks, for gaming, and all the rest of it, without actually having the technology there? Yes, there are kind of good, robust age assurance measures that you can kind of have, but it's all based on self-declaration and all the rest of it. So that's a big problem as I see it, and a big kind of hurdle. But I'm quite pleased that we've been part of engagement with DCMS and with the Home Office. It just depends on how far the ministers want to go, I think, at this stage.
I mean, kind of based on what you said, I'm wondering, and perhaps this is a question for Lorna and Kostya. Does self-regulation have a role here? Could all this have been avoided if there was a little bit more initiative within the video game industry to prevent things like loot boxes, for example, becoming big stories dominating the news? Would that work?
I think the time for the possibility of self-regulation has gone. And I think you point quite tellingly to loot boxes with regards to video games. I agree entirely with what Kostya was saying, that big tech's out there and possibly doing way worse stuff, but there was a resistance, and whether this was amplified by the press, the media in general or not, there was a lost opportunity to clean up the position, and I don't think that helps. So I think there is a big skepticism around tech in general, this sort of user-facing tech. Obviously, AI is a god, but there is skepticism, and certainly amongst a quite significant number of Lords and backbench MPs, as mentioned, but a lot of the campaign groups. So I think having a framework is probably the next best thing. Obviously, yeah, there are going to be teething issues around it, but in terms of opening a space for industry to contribute, and I think a certain amount of space for individual actors to achieve the desired ends in their own way, there is a potential there. For the want of a better term, it's probably in the co-regulation box. But yeah, I think this sort of framework law is where we're at.
Yeah, I think the ship has sailed in terms of having some kind of carve out for games. I mean, they're going to be caught in one way or another, but there's still a lot of room for interpretation, and there will be, even after we get more codes of practice published. So there will be an opportunity to educate Ofcom as to why the games industry is different to Facebook and Instagram, and why, when it comes to some of these duties, the bar needs to be higher, lower, or, as Lorna said, a different shape, so that it actually fits what that specific industry, and why they, yes, although they may be caught, and yes, it's maybe too late to argue that they're not, why they need to be approached in a slightly different way, because frankly, we're not talking about the same levels of evil as what was originally targeted by this.
If I can just follow up, I mean, obviously the devil's always in the detail and the implementation, but the word proportionate is scattered through the draft bill like sprinkles on the top of a birthday cake.
Sorry, you were going to say something, Michaela?
I was planning to open the floor for anyone from the audience or anyone else from the panelists if they have any question.
Can I play dibs? Because I do have one. I mean, I was fascinated by the discussion, and I have this sensation that now regulation of the video game industry became viral. We have been stuff to deal with every single year on different aspects of video games, and vast majority of the time was not about video games. I mean, the regulation was for something else, and video games was caught. And my question is, since it's proven that video games are really good at doing stuff, is there any way you think we can invert the cycle, start doing something for video games that then will have a benefit for society as a whole? Because I think if you solve a problem like duty of care within video games in a way that video games can do it properly, then to be honest, Facebook and Twitter is going to be easier.
I think the problem is the industry's just done so well, and it's so successful, and it's so big that it just attracts attention. So there's like this massive spotlight that it's probably never had before, frankly, not to this extent, that is now shining on it. So it was inevitable that, I mean, among all the good, there are like this, I'm sure there's non-compliances, and there is bad stuff that happens, but you know, no more than any other industry. But unfortunately, when you shine such a massive spotlight on it, all of that stuff comes to the fore, and you know, the media likes a good story, and one thing leads to another, which is frustrating. But I think the key is how we respond to it, how the industry responds to it, and that if we engage with it constructively, you know, there's no point kind of being upset or complaining about it. You know, we are where we are, as Lorna says, and this is going to happen. This is the reality. So I think there is an opportunity still to kind of engage with this whole process constructively and show, as I say, that games should be put in a slightly different box to some of these other big tech players that, you know, they're the real people you should be after.
I suppose the issue is understanding that difference, maybe in technical terms or in the way the risks arise. So you can say, okay, well, you're doing codes of practice. Well, here's one we prepared earlier for the games industry, and this is how we take all these things that are in general guidance or the bill into being, and sort of maybe then that is something for the regulatory system to build on.
And it will be up to the bigger players. Yeah, and it will be up to the bigger players to lead the way on this, because there's almost, you know, when you talk about social media, you know, the giants among the social media scene will be the ones who lead the way and saying, right, well, this is how we think, this is what we think a risk assessment is, and this is what we think category 1 services should and should not be required to police, and how they should police it. And then, you know, the regulator will look at it, and you will end up somewhere in between where the two positions are. So I think almost kind of this, I feel like the same thing needs to happen in the games industry. So the biggest players, the ones that are most likely to be affected by this, you know, will have to step up, and maybe that's through UKI, through the industry body, or in whatever way, step up and say, well, you know, this is how games companies need to be treated. Frankly, you know, what games companies are we talking about? Educate the regulator as to what it is in the context of games companies that we actually mean by user-to-user services, because I bet you that there's probably not a good level of understanding there at all as to what we're actually talking about in that context.
Is that understanding point is a really good one, actually. And you know, and I think, you know, if I look at our own game, right, we probably have about 10% of our players that will engage with microtransactions on any level, and it's a smaller number of that then that are specifically into the kind of RNG sort of loot box kind of type stuff. And and again, for us, we give our players complete choice. There's a whole version of RuneScape has 0 microtransactions in it whatsoever, right? And actually, 3/4 of, I think, the players that play RuneScape or old school RuneScape play old school, and that has no MTX in it at all. So then you've got this kind of smaller sort of group that do play RuneScape, and like I say, less than 10% are actually engaging with RNG, sort of loot box kind of type stuff. So it's a very kind of small subset of a subset of a subset. And then if you actually kind of zoom out and look at the wider kind of games industry, there are 60-70% of games that don't have loot box stuff in there. It's just because people see the FIFA stuff with the buying the kits and the kind of skins and all that kind of stuff, that then there is a core of backbenchers in the Lords and actually sitting around there in government that kind of seize upon that. But the other side of it is, we were hearing from government very early, sort of right throughout the pandemic, of actually, we don't need to worry about games. It's a very successful industry. You're paying your taxes. You're keeping people employed. You're keeping people kind of engaged online and all the rest of it. So on one hand, they were very, very happy for us, and then we kind of come out of it, and then we're facing this kind of ever tighter regulation and being kind of caught up in it rather than something kind of bespoke. And there is a frustration from us in the industry, I think, in that, and actually, we've got a really good online safety track record, far better than the social networks, I would say, and that isn't necessarily acknowledged, I think, as much as perhaps it could be. I don't want to kind of come on here and just say, oh, well, for me, and there's nothing we can do, and we're absolutely perfect. I know we're not, and we've looked at ourselves quite closely at Jagex, and that's part of why we've engaged with people like DCMS and the Home Office and all the rest of it. So yeah, our thoughts are we're getting caught up in it, but actually we are quite proactive, and we want to do more, and we are doing more. And the next couple of months will be interesting on the loot box debate, I think.
Kelvin, sorry, quick follow-up. It wouldn't be just easier to take, the 3 points you were discussing, the 3 areas we were discussing a year ago on the duty of care Jagex, and just add that as a bill? Because that's understandable, it's clear, and there are not so many difficulties with definition.
Yeah, but that's because it was written by me and not a policy advisor in Westminster.
We had a question from Alex on the proposed regulatory framework's position in relation to gambling advertising in online games. FIFA comes to mind, for instance. So it's not the gambling itself, but the advertising of what potentially can be labeled as gambling.
I haven't seen it. I'll let Lorna correct me. I haven't seen any references to that specifically, because I think advertising probably falls more under the ASA's thing, but the ASA's remit. But I know they are very keen on that, and they're actually consulting with the government about bringing in their own network. What's it called? Network something standards, which will basically apply to advertising on social media and the like, including sensitive advertising for sensitive areas like gambling and HFSS, high-end fat, sugar and salt foods, etc. So it probably falls under a slightly different regulators' remit. But Lorna has a whole printout of the bill with post-it notes on it, so she may well correct me on that. There it is.
I think I agree, actually. The government or DCMS ran a separate consultation on online advertising. I'm not sure if that was about the content of the adverts themselves, or more broadly about, the targeting of adverts and who's advertising and that sort of process. So I'm a little unsure as to where that sits, whether it sits within the online safety bill, and the risk assessments certainly refer to business models, so it could do, or whether they're going to envisage, you know, a separate review of online advertising, or leave it to the ASA to develop its own standards. So it's a bit of a murky area. There is a question about scams, because at one point the government was quite clear that things like scams and the promotion of scams, and advertising dodgy things was going to be out. But I think in the press release they said that at least some of it was going to be in, but I don't think the draft bill had caught up with the press release. So that's even more confusing.
Yeah, there was a lot of last minute stuff that was clearly shoved in to keep people happy, wasn't it? Like the romance scams. And maybe we should just mention this whole point about preserving freedom of expression and, you know, democratic type content, which creates, as you say, a lovely balancing act. So the point is, you have all these duties of care. There's all this stuff you're supposed to police, including in some cases stuff that's legal but potentially harmful if you're a category 1 company. And yet you're also supposed to balance all that out by making sure you don't police it so much that you're actually affecting freedom of expression and affecting democratic, which I think is a reference to, you know, affecting the outcomes of elections or trying to influence that. And how do you do that? I don't quite understand at this point. But it's been left to the industry to decide.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's trying to say you can't take political speech down, or whether it's saying if you're going to take political speech down, you have to do so evenly across the political spectrum. Slightly different. And ditto with journalistic content.
Which I would say is very relevant for social networks, pretty damn irrelevant for games.
Not as relevant for somebody chatting in RuneScape about the outcome of the next election and you having to police. Right. I mean, let's be real, that's what we're talking about here, right? That, or somebody using voice comms. I don't actually know, does RuneScape have voice comms built in?
No, it's just chat.
No, fine, so it's chat, that's what we're talking about. It's some people in a room chatting to their guildies about who's going to win the next election. And that is a user-to-user service that is caught by the bill.
I suppose the obligation is to consider it, not necessarily do anything about it. So consider the protection of that speech, not necessarily regulate it or put rules in place or whatever, if you've considered that there isn't a big issue.
Well, then the sort of devious person in me says, well, that's down to then how I interpret the ability to self-assess my risk and to put myself out of scope of that. And
yeah, I mean, at the very least, it probably means you'll need a bunch of extra policies for all this stuff, just so they're publicly published and visible as to what your stance is and all these things. And then, yeah, a lot of it will come down to how involved does the risk assessment need to be. Yeah, I mean, I've literally had a question on this very subject, which I can't answer at the moment because I don't know. But if it is just a kind of a self-policing, sign a piece of paper saying I've done it, and then if I get checked, then okay, I might have to pull out my piece of paper and prove that it was thorough enough and I took into account all these considerations. That's one thing. If it's a no, you're actually going to have to instruct somebody to come in and do this for you, then that's a very different proposition.
And I kind of wonder, I just wanted to say, I wonder where does this leave the user? If we're adding a bunch of policies, which is usually very long documents that nobody reads or understands. So how is the user going to be informed in a way that they can comprehend, especially if we're talking here about children? How is this service being designed in a way that is indeed safe and not harmful? I wonder whether the bill or any of the codes of practice or guidances out there provide any enlightenment on how to achieve this. kind of.
No, but they tell you that's what you have to achieve, but they don't tell you how to achieve it. But yeah, you're absolutely right that a child has to be able to understand all of your policies, understand how and why content is taken down and for what reason, understand what their rights are to appeal the taking down of that content and how they actually go about doing that. You know, what buttons do they have to click, who do they have to contact, and all of this has to be explained in an accessible way.
But in a way, you know, sort of, I can understand that that's going to be difficult. But if you're providing a service to someone, shouldn't you make sure they understand the terms on which you're providing it? You know, I do think there's something there about thinking about who your users are. And I think maybe the problem is that lawyers write terms of conditions, and we write those terms of conditions to allow our client the maximum amount of wriggle room and protection on just in case. And that doesn't fit very well with clear and accessible. That's my opinion anyway. Having in the dim and distant past drafted terms and conditions, the comprehensibility to children was not at the forefront of my mind when I did so.
It's a really interesting point, actually, because part of the age-appropriate design code stuff is to be able to present a child-friendly version of all of your terms of service and privacy policies and all the rest of it. So Jagex, we've just made the decision to rewrite the whole lot and attempt to kind of do it in that way with some kind of additional kind of help and support, if we can, to kind of help illuminate things for younger people. But to the point that Kosty said, that there is no definition of what it is. There is no help or there is no support for that. You know, we've even talked about showing it to our own kids who are like kind of 13, 14 years old and getting some feedback from them, because you know, how else can you do that? You know, and that's the extent that we're kind of looking at this in terms of actually taking it seriously, but then going, well, where's the professional help? Actually, you know, where you know, how can we achieve what is there as a worthy and laudable aim, but without any help and support to achieve it? But we'll do it.
I'm conscious of the time. We have reached the hour that we've had for tonight's session. I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight and sharing your views and experiences of 2020 in the video game space. I'm hoping that if anyone from the audience who's watching it now or will watch later has any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. More than happy to answer them, engage with them later. Thank you very much, Kelvin, Lorna, and Kostya for being here tonight. Thanks, Gaetano, for a lovely welcome, and Alex for the visuals for our session. And hopefully we will see you all and more on at our next session, which is on the 27th of May. I'm hoping I remembered the date correctly. And that will be themed looking ahead. So we will be thinking about where is the industry heading next and how can we ensure that it's heading in the right direction. So thank you again. Thanks everyone for coming, and have a lovely evening or morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and stay in touch. Bye.
Thank you.